some pralines, and feel free to just keep getting up and getting more until they're gone, because we got a lot, and they've got to be gone because I can't eat any Lord knows. Going to have a very interesting type of reading/event tonight, because I've heard that Tom and Rod are going to get up here and tag team this, so that I only got to introduce one. So, as the proprietor of the bookstore, I have to say, I love Tom's book, I love Rod's book and stuff like that, but I got a lot of other books in here too. Please give them a gander. All right, Tom and Rod, let's go.
So this whole thing was Rod's idea.
I'm Tom and that's Rod.
No, it's not true. And we've known each other since the 80s. I think I met you when you were the editor of Texas Observer.
3 at that time.
Right. And we've known each other on and off for a long time. And it turns out that we know a lot about New Orleans, and we live there. And it's been sort of seeped into our souls. And it was so great to see Mark and Susan sing those songs. So, I did a really stupid thing. I sent out an email to about 300 people, and I said that Rod and I were going to tag team wrestle them, and at this point, and there's no contest. There's no way. So I just wanted to set that straight.
Like I said, we were talking over at Trudy's a little while ago about when we first got here, and for me it was in 1973 when I was working for the AP, and worked up in the Capitol, and I'd been in Dallas right before that, just had gotten out of the Army, and they wanted me to come to Austin to report, and I didn't want to go to Austin. I had a girlfriend in Dallas, like, I don't want to go to Austin, and I got here, and I'm like, oh, I get it. Then I didn't want to go back to Dallas. So. I was actually in New Orleans the day after Katrina hit. I drove down there. Took me about 15 hours to get to New Orleans from San Antonio. I was working for the Express News at that time. And when Tom's book came out, I was there for about 3 weeks, and I read it, and everybody that thinks they know or does actually know anything about New Orleans looks to see if the person writing about it knows what the hell they're talking about, and he does. And also those were things that actually were going on there at that time in the immediate weeks after that. So it was like reading an account that I kind of wish I had written, and it was very compelling. He had a great ear for the dialogue, which is, as you may know from New Orleans, is different from the South, from a lot of other places too. There's parts of New Orleans, you may know, sounds much more like you're in New York. But he had a great ear for that, and great descriptions of the scenario at that time, which was pretty chilling, and it was really nasty. And the convention center was a place, I think I was one of the first people to go in there in the media, and it was big and dark and smelly, and some people were dead and couldn't get out. And so Tom's book deals with people trying to get out of all that, and how hard even that was. You wouldn't think it would be, but I know lots of people that couldn't get out. They were sending DEA people down in there towards the inlet, but they knew nothing about any of that. They're highly suspicious of anybody. And I remember one time they wouldn't let a guy put his bike on a bus to go back to the convention center to take shelter for the evening, because they weren't allowing bicycles on the bus. And it was his only means of transportation. The streets were flooded. It was stuff like that. It was maddening. And congratulations for getting that right. So I think what we just, well, actually Tom decided this, but along with the tag team wrestling match, but we thought we would talk a little about our books to set them up, and then we would hire each other to actually read the passages.
Very good. So, right. So thank you very much, Rod. So unlike Rod, who was there, I was not there, except that I felt I was, because I had lived in New Orleans for several years earlier. We lived there when my son was 5 months old and stayed for 4 or 5 years, and so I felt that I knew the city very well, and do. And there are other people here too. Patrick is here, who's a New Orleanian who grew up in New Orleans. and made many friends there, as Rod did. And so I was in that position of watching from afar. I was actually in Chicago when all the news footage started coming in about the flooding and other things, the looting and various things. And that was just astonishing and amazing. I couldn't take my eyes off of it. And I began then to read everything I could. I really didn't have an idea about writing a book about New Orleans. And this is a novel, actually, Many Rivers to Cross. But it's inspired by, based on, just books and books and books that were written by folks like Rod who were there. Also blogs, emails, documentaries. There's really a ton of things written about Katrina, and exceptionally good work. And I wanted to put it all together in a narrative where the reader could feel this at water at waist level, okay? So that you felt at every moment that you were in this book that you were wading through an experience or trying to get on a boat or whatever. And that really, that sort of feeling, the sensual stuff there, the water and its temperature and the uncomfortable thing and the fear of drowning and the fear of loss and that sort of thing. I think novels can actually do that very well. So it can certainly sort of be nonfiction, but that's where I'm coming from. And I felt a little paralyzed by not being there, and also was not able to be in touch with so many friends we had made there, because the phone links, all the links were down, the phones were dead. It was really hard to stay in touch. So at some point, my son and I, who was in high school at the time, just decided to go to New Orleans a couple of months after Katrina. And we did. We rented a car and we drove around and we looked at everything. We done the Lower and Ninth Ward, and we had good folks who were there on the ground who had experienced all this show us around. And from that experience, and lots of notes and lots of reading, I wrote Many Rivers to Cross. But before I go one step further and tell you how good Rod's book is, I want to say thank you to Joe. Where are you, Joe? Joe, thank you for Malvern Books. This is fantastic. I mean, it's an independent bookstore in a time when bookstores are closing down everywhere, independent or not, even the big chains. And Joe is managing to keep this thing open, and he's thriving. And if you look around at the selections, they're amazing. And I say thank you very much, Joe, and right on, and let's keep supporting this. Now, Rod's book, which is called South, don't miss that comma, America, is really just superb. I've written some crime novels myself, and I'm envious of this because it's about a guy named Jack Prine who comes to live in New Orleans. He's from Dallas, where he's been a journalist and so forth. And he's sort of hung up in New Orleans, and I'll read something of his work in just a minute. But Rod captures the sort of the character of New Orleans beautifully, at the same time weaving a page-turning whodunit, sort of book. And some of my favorite parts of the book are when he takes us into Mississippi and some of the rural areas of the South, driving around and looking at things, looking at small towns, looking at Highway 61 and the blues and that sort of thing. So it's a fabulous book, and I can't recommend it enough.
Thank you very much. So I guess we should just read. Huh?
Go ahead.
Okay.
Should I go first or should you?
I'll go first. Oh, do you want to kind of
should I?
discuss the book a little bit? Or
Well, yeah,
start reading?
let me just say that it's a very simple book in a way. It's essentially about a man, an African-American dad who lives in Opelousas, which is southwest Louisiana, and his daughter lives in New Orleans, and she, for various reasons, she and her two small children, 7 and 9, can't get out of the city, and they're essentially trapped in their house, and it's flooding. It's in Gentilly, and the water's rising, and they're going to have to go in the attic and then on the roof. And Dad says, I'm coming to get you. So this is a rescue book in which Dad and his old 14-foot John boat, which is handmade, he's dragging it behind his pickup, and he heads for New Orleans when everybody else is leaving New Orleans. He's trying to get in and save his daughter and grandchildren. And the only other person you need to know about is Duval, who is the young man in his boat that he's sort of, later on you find out he sort of dragged him along. He's the daddy of the two children who are going to be on the roof.
Okay. And I think this will kind of set it up. The two men expected to encounter state troopers on their way into the city. But once they passed through the blinding rain of Baton Rouge and climbed up onto the long elevated stretch of Interstate 10 over the bayous, they saw no traffic ahead, only an endless maze of limbs blown across the road from the tops of marsh trees still swaying in the wind. They were the only fools trying to get into New Orleans. National Guard, Red Cross, emergency rescue vehicles, not a trace of them anywhere. The radio was reporting that the levees had collapsed in at least 3 places, and the city was filling with water from Lake Pontchartrain and the canals. Citizens were being warned to seek higher ground, which meant attics and rooftops and the upper stories of parking garages. No one in the right mind would venture into a city built 6 feet below sea level after the eye of a Category 3 hurricane had slammed ashore only a few miles to the east near Slidell and the state line. But Dee had called her father in Opelousas to say that the water was rising in the streets of her Gentilly neighborhood, where she lived with her 2 small children. She felt trapped and desperate. She was a strong young woman, but he could hear panic in her voice. "I'm sorry I was so hard-headed, Daddy," she'd said on the phone that morning. Hodge had asked her to leave the city on Saturday after the governor had declared a state of emergency. Hodge's home in Opelousas was less than a 3-hour trip into Cajun country in the southwest part of the state, and he urged her and the children to come and stay. But she didn't take this storm seriously. She'd left New Orleans during hurricane alerts in years past, and they'd usually turned out to be false alarms, the eye veering down to the Texas coast or curling back on Florida. Last year, during the Hurricane Ivan scare, she and the kids were on the road for 14 hours, bumper to bumper. All New Orleans suffered was a little rain and wind. By the time the mayor had issued a mandatory evacuation on Sunday morning, as Hurricane Katrina took dead aim on the city, the highways were gridlocked in the somber August heat. "We were scared to be in that line," she'd admitted during her telephone call. "I saw some thugs drag a man out of his car." Only 2 vehicles ahead of her, one of them pistol whipped the poor man as he begged for mercy. They stole his car and left him bleeding on the side of the road. When she heard another gang of loud young thugs prancing around the cars behind her, project teenagers looking for vehicles to carjack, it was more than she could bear. Her 7-year-old daughter Ashley was crying and couldn't catch her breath, so Dee pulled the little Toyota out of line and rutted her way across the grassy median. Speeding off down an empty lane in the contraflow, she headed back into the city. "Don't worry, sugar," Hodge had told her. "I'm coming to get you and the kids. Stay calm until I get there. You still have that Smith & Wesson I gave you. Don't be afraid to use it if you have to." Hodges guided his old GMC pickup and boat trailer through the obstacle course of scattered limbs on the interstate, the bald tires hydroplaning over a slick, wet mat of green leaves that unfurled as far as the eye could see. It was mid-afternoon on Monday when they crossed over the spillway and entered the city. The rain had let up, but the sky was still gray and ominous, a cauldron of clouds boiling northward. Although Katrina had moved inland and now was battering the Mississippi pines, its tailwinds were still blowing debris across the roads here and in New Orleans. Power lines were down everywhere like a jungle of sagging vines. You could see a piece of the swollen lake off to the left. The slate gray water was choppy as the open sea. Duval spoke for the first time in nearly an hour. He was listening to a pocket-sized radio plugged into his ear. "Radio says the cops can gang anybody's boat they want," he said. "Only got 5 boats in the entire New Orleans police force." He looked at the older man behind the wheel. "Mayor says cooperate if the police want your boat." Hodge grunted a laugh and shook his head. He was a tall, raw-boned man who had shed 20 pounds since the heart attack last year and felt better than he had in a long time. He was 2 years shy of his 60th birthday and had fought in Vietnam as a Marine leatherneck, which felt like another man's life now, something that had happened to a young blood he hardly remembered anymore. All he cared about right now was his daughter and 2 grandchildren. They were stranded in a flooding neighborhood, and he was coming to pick them up and take them back to his farm outside Opelousas where they would be safe. Nobody was going to stop him, not New Orleans police or National Guard or God Almighty himself. Nobody was going to confiscate that 14-foot John boat strapped down in the trailer behind him. "It might get heavy," he told the young man, the father of Dee's children. Hodge had come close to knocking this homeboy around a few times back when Duval first walked out on her and the kids. The player had a weakness for other women and street rock, or so Hodge had heard. But he needed Duval now. He needed a second pair of arms in case they had to paddle the John boat. He needed somebody who'd grown up in this crazy, doomed city and knew the streets. And he needed somebody with a cell phone. Hodge didn't own one. He didn't have much use for it on the farm. "Keep your head down, son," he told Duval, "and we'll make out all right." The interstate ran as straight as a razor through the suburbs of Kenner and Metairie, where white folk had fled decades ago to live in big ranch-style homes and send their kids to safe white schools. Towering light poles along the freeway had toppled in the hurricane wind, and Hodge slowed his pickup to swerve around them in the scattered glass. He'd never set foot in those shopping malls. He could see them from the road, their parking lots now knee-deep in murky water. The roof had been ripped off a Sears department store, and large sheets of plate glass hung like broken teeth in a row of nearby businesses. A huge billboard sign had keeled over onto the new cars swamped in a dealership lot. As they approached the freeway interchange where the exit ramp trailed off into a shallow lake of neighborhoods, Hodge could see a score of people stranded on the overpass, shouting and waving at the truck in desperation. They wanted out of this city by any means possible. Poor bastards, he said to himself, where the hell is the police? Saving their own sweet ass, Duval said with a smirk. A mile farther on, the long white sawhorses of a police barricade lay splintered and strewn across every lane. I guess it's coming up, Hodge said. Say what? Duval asked, removing the earpiece. The end of the line. Hodge slowed down a little when they reached sight of an ornate old cemetery whose Gothic white mausoleums rose like church spires out of the flood. Lights were flashing above a New Orleans police cruiser parked sideways in the middle of the interstate. He downshifted and tapped his wet brakes, testing them. When they drew closer, they could see that the vehicle was unoccupied. Its windows had been smashed, and one of the tires was gone. Must be cutthroat out here, Duval said, if the man can't take care of his own ride. Hodge stopped the truck, stepped out of the cab, and stomped his work boots on the wet pavement, restoring the circulation in his legs. The rain had settled into a fine mist that swirled around him in the trailing winds of the hurricane. He understood now that the police car was a warning sign, like a human skull impaled on a tall spike. He gazed past the white cruiser and saw that 50 yards away, the interstate disappeared like a boat ramp into floodwaters. Farther in the distance, the shadowed cityscape of downtown New Orleans stood grim and powerless in the rainy gray gloom. You couldn't get there from here. And I'm going to skip just to the last of that chapter where he finally gets his John boat into the water, about to get into the water. The police don't think he can do it. So he cranks the engine. At the sound of the first crank, the three of them turned around to the police. The John boat was floating aimlessly a dozen yards out in the floodwater, Duval kneeling over the motor. He gave the rope another crank, and the old Mercury outboard sputtered again. Yo, dog, the tall deputy shouted, jogging toward the water with his hands gripping the pistol underneath his poncho. Bring that boat in. Duval didn't look up. He pulled the rope again, and the motor coughed. Hodge could smell gasoline in the air. Homeboy had flooded the engine. Me and my son-in-law need to be going, he said to the deputy standing beside him. Son-in-law was far from true, but it sounded better than baby daddy crackhead that knocked up my daughter twice. Can I have my license back? He said. The deputy reached under his poncho and withdrew a pair of handcuffs. You can step over here by the cruiser, Chief, he said, and put your hands behind your back.
Thank you.